I wasn't looking for a mystery until the same doors kept appearing in city after city. A museum in Europe, a railway station in America, a courthouse, a library, an exhibition hall, different nations, different architects, yet every entrance seemed to tower over the people approaching it in almost exactly the same way. The historical record is remarkably clear. Monumental civic architecture embraced oversized arches, giant timber and bronze doors, tall windows, ceremonial staircases, and imposing columns inspired by Greece and Rome, especially through the Beaux-Arts tradition. Buildings such as Grand Central Terminal, the New York Public Library, the U.S. Capitol, the Palace of Fine Arts, and countless European institutions were intentionally designed to communicate permanence and civic importance. For most people, that is where the story ends. But the deeper I looked, the stranger it became. The records explain how these entrances were built and why architects wanted them, yet they do not explain why entire societies seemed determined to make everyday civic life feel almost sacred. Again and again, photographs reduce ordinary people to tiny figures beneath immense portals that still dominate the frame more than a century later. This does not prove hidden civilizations or forgotten giants. It raises a quieter question. If these buildings reflected the values of their age, what have our own buildings begun to say about us instead? The first thing you notice is not the ornament. It is the scale. Look closely at almost any old photograph of these entrances, and the same imbalance appears. A person standing before one of them rarely fills more than a fraction of the doorway. Heavy bronze leaves stretch upward toward carved stone arches. Recessed portals swallow the shadows around them. Marble staircases widen far beyond what a single visitor requires. Oversized handles sit at a height that makes nearby adults look almost childlike. Massive columns frame the opening, as if the building is preparing the mind before the body ever crosses the threshold. At first, it feels like coincidence. Then another city appears, another station, another library, another courthouse. The proportions repeat with remarkable consistency, but one detail refuses to fit. These were not isolated monuments built only for kings or emperors. They were places intended for ordinary citizens. People entered them to catch trains, borrow books, attend court, study, or participate in civic life. Somehow, everyday routines unfolded inside architecture that treated those routines as ceremonies. That contrast is difficult to ignore. Consider Grand Central Terminal in New York, completed in 1913. Long before passengers reached the famous main concourse, they encountered entrances of extraordinary scale. The building functioned as one of the busiest transportation hubs in the United States, yet it welcomed travelers with the visual language of a palace rather than a machine. The stone portals, monumental windows, carved details, and immense interior volumes announced something larger than transportation. They announced arrival, not simply at a destination, but into the civic life of a nation. And the deeper you look, the more physical the evidence becomes. The worn stone thresholds, the polished edges of marble steps, the weathered bronze touched by thousands of hands. The doors were not only symbolic objects, they were used every day by ordinary people moving through an environment built to make movement feel important. The official records explain every stage of Grand Central's planning and construction. Architects deliberately designed impressive entrances to create dignity, orientation, and emotional impact. Nothing mysterious is required to explain the engineering. Yet the photographs remain strangely powerful. Look at the people in them. Horse-drawn wagons wait along the street. Early automobiles sit beneath the facade. Crowds in dark coats move toward the entrance. Children climb broad steps that seem almost too large for them. The camera unintentionally records something remarkable. The people become measuring tools. Their bodies reveal the true size of the architecture more clearly than any blueprint could. The doorway occupies the frame. The building dominates the scene. The human figures almost vanish beneath it. The records explain the construction. The feeling remains harder to describe. This is where the pattern begins. By the late 19th century, Monumental entrances had become one of the defining characteristics of Beaux-Arts, classical revival, and neoclassical civic architecture. This was not accidental. Architects across Europe and North America increasingly shared a common education and a common architectural language. Much of that influence flowed through the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where generations of architects studied symmetry, hierarchy, axial planning, classical proportion, ceremonial approaches, domes, grand staircases, oversized portals, and carefully choreographed public space. These ideas spread remarkably far. Different countries, different governments, different cultures. Yet many public buildings began speaking almost the same visual language. Look across the Atlantic and the pattern emerges almost immediately. London, Paris, Antwerp, New York, Boston, Chicago, Vienna, Berlin, Milan, St. Petersburg. Different skylines, different languages, different political systems. Yet the entrances repeatedly display the same monumental vocabulary. Towering portals, carved lintels, broad flights of marble steps, recessed doorways, Corinthian columns, and heavy timber or bronze doors framed by carefully balanced stone facades. The more cities you compare, the less the similarities appear accidental. The official explanation is both logical and well documented. Monumental entrances communicated permanence. They projected civic authority. They symbolized democratic ideals. They established harmony through classical composition. Large doors also served practical purposes. Public ceremonies required generous access. Oversized furnishings and equipment needed to pass inside. Natural ventilation mattered before widespread mechanical climate control. Vast interior halls demanded appropriately scaled entrances. Thick timber construction, massive bronze hardware, and deep stone surrounds also reflected durability in buildings expected to serve generations. Everything about the engineering makes sense. Historic architectural treatises even describe monumental entrances as symbolic thresholds. Passing through them was intended to elevate visitors psychologically before entering important institutions. The architecture itself became part of the experience. That explanation deserves to be taken seriously. It accounts for the design philosophy. It accounts for the construction. It accounts for the materials. But architecture does more than solve engineering problems. It shapes expectation. Imagine approaching a library whose staircase rises like the entrance to a temple. Imagine placing your hand on an oversized bronze pull before entering. Imagine crossing a threshold worn smooth by decades of footsteps. The building begins communicating long before anyone inside speaks. That message appears again and again between roughly 1850 and 1930. Libraries, museums, universities, railway stations, opera houses, government buildings, exhibition halls, each served a different purpose, yet each welcomed the public through architecture that emphasized ceremony rather than convenience. Notice what rarely changes in the photographs. The doorway is almost always taller than expected. The staircase occupies more space than necessity alone would require. The entrance is carefully centered within the facade, drawing every visitor toward a single point. Even when the streets outside were crowded, muddy, or still developing, the portal projected permanence. The strange part is not that architects admired Greece and Rome. The strange part is how many societies, separated by oceans, governments, and cultures, reached remarkably similar conclusions about what public architecture should make people feel before they ever stepped inside. One of the clearest examples stands in New York City. The Stephen A. Schwarzman Building of the New York Public Library opened in 1911 after 16 years of construction. Its monumental bronze entrance doors remain among the building's defining features. Visitors climb broad marble staircases before reaching them. The sequence is deliberate. Approach, ascend, pause, enter. Nothing about this arrangement is accidental. The architecture slows you down before allowing you inside. Look closely at historic photographs taken from the foot of the staircase. The building controls where your eye travels. Wide marble steps guide every visitor toward the center. Massive, carved columns frame the entrance. Deeply recessed bronze doors disappear into shadow beneath richly detailed stonework. Even before anyone reaches the threshold, the building has already established a sense of order. The symbolism is obvious. Knowledge is important. Learning deserves respect. Public education belongs within architecture that reflects its value. The official explanation is compelling, yet the photographs reveal another layer. Notice the readers climbing the steps. Some carry books beneath one arm. Others pause to speak before entering. Their bodies become the scale reference the architects never needed to draw. The bronze handles rise almost to shoulder height. The doors extend far above every person standing beside them. The surrounding stone occupies far more of the image than the people themselves. The camera unintentionally preserves something the written records cannot fully capture. The architecture dominates every composition. The visitors become temporary. Again, this proves nothing extraordinary. No hidden civilization. No forgotten race, no impossible construction, only an emotional contradiction that repeats itself. Why did societies devote enormous resources to making civic institutions feel almost sacred? This question becomes even more interesting because these buildings served everyone. They were not private palaces. They belonged to the public. The New York Public Library welcomed immigrants learning English, children discovering books for the first time, researchers pursuing new ideas, and ordinary New Yorkers seeking nothing more dramatic than a quiet place to read. Yet every one of them entered through doors that could easily have belonged to a royal palace. Perhaps the scale reflected confidence. Perhaps city leaders wanted knowledge to appear permanent. Perhaps architects believed that beautiful surroundings encouraged civic responsibility. Those are all reasonable interpretations. But one detail continues to resist a purely practical explanation. Stand close enough to study the entrance itself, the weathered bronze, the thickness of the doors, the carved stone jambs, the polished marble worn smooth by more than a century of footsteps. These are not decorative details added as an afterthought. They are the threshold itself, designed to make crossing from the street into the institution feel deliberate. If transportation architecture encouraged movement, this building encouraged reflection. That distinction matters. Libraries were not treated as temporary public services. They became monuments to knowledge. The doorway itself became part of the lesson before a single page was opened. The records explain the dimensions. They explain the materials. They explain the structural systems. But they cannot completely explain why so many people believed architecture itself could shape the way citizens thought about learning. That question lingers quietly beneath every photograph, and once it appears here, it becomes difficult not to notice it elsewhere. Cross the Atlantic. The pattern refuses to disappear. In Antwerp, Belgium, Antwerpen Centraal Railway Station opened in 1905 with one of the most monumental station entrances in Europe. Travelers arriving beneath its enormous facade encountered a building whose appearance suggested national pride as much as transportation. Stone arches, towering windows, rich ornament, massive entrances, heavy timber doors set deep within carved stone portals, bronze hardware polished by generations of travelers. Inside, engineering and beauty worked together rather than competing. Look closely at early photographs of the main entrance. Passengers carrying luggage appear almost incidental. The station itself commands the image. People naturally become measuring tools once again. A man standing beside the doorway barely reaches the lower portion of the entrance. The staircase occupies nearly the full width of the frame. The architecture quietly declares that travel is not simply movement between cities. It is participation in the life of a nation. That is an important distinction. Grand Central transformed transportation into civic ceremony. The New York Public Library transformed learning into civic ceremony. Now, Antwerpen Centraal suggests that even the act of arriving in a city could become part of a country's identity. Across Europe, similar ambitions appeared elsewhere. London, Paris, Vienna, Berlin, Milan, St. Petersburg, railway stations, museums, opera houses, universities, government ministries, banks, different architects, different governments, different languages. Yet remarkably similar entrances continued to appear. Tall arches, deeply recessed portals, broad staircases, weathered stone, massive oak and bronze doors, carved capitals supporting monumental facades. The repetition itself becomes evidence. No single architect controlled this movement. No single government imposed it. Instead, a remarkably consistent architectural language spread across Europe and North America, adapting itself to different institutions while preserving the same underlying vocabulary. The influence of Beaux-Arts education helps explain much of this consistency. Architects studied similar precedents. They admired similar classical models. They learned similar principles of composition. That explains why the buildings resemble one another. But it does not fully explain why so many different institutions adopted exactly the same emotional strategy. A railway station is not a museum. A bank is not an opera house. A university is not a ministry. Their purposes could hardly be more different, yet they often invited the public through entrances designed with remarkably similar proportions. Look again at the photographs. Notice how the architecture almost ignores the scale of the individual. The carved stone remains sharp and permanent. The bronze doors dominate the composition. Crowds blur into movement. Buildings remain still. Perhaps that was the intention. People came and went. Institutions endured. Architecture became a physical reminder that individual lives were temporary, while the ideas those institutions represented were expected to outlast generations. Whether purchasing a train ticket, attending an exhibition, opening a bank account, enrolling at a university, or entering a government office, citizens repeatedly crossed thresholds designed to make ordinary public life feel consequential. The records describe dimensions. The photographs preserve something more difficult to measure. Not awe alone. Expectation. The expectation that civilization itself should possess a monumental face. In 1915, visitors entered the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco during the Panama Pacific International Exposition. Unlike many monumental civic buildings, this structure was originally intended to be temporary, yet its designers borrowed heavily from Roman and Greek forms. Colonnades stretched across reflective water. Monumental arches framed enormous openings. Broad stairways led visitors toward carefully composed vistas. Towering columns supported richly decorated entablatures. Everything about the architecture suggested permanence, yet the exposition itself was never meant to last. That contradiction is fascinating. Look closely at surviving photographs. Families stroll beneath arches that resemble ancient monuments. Children pause beside columns several times their height. The architecture fills nearly every frame. The visitors appear almost incidental. Without knowing the context, it would be easy to assume these buildings had stood there for centuries, but they had not. Most visitors understood that much of what surrounded them would eventually disappear. That raises a different kind of question. Why build temporary architecture with the visual language of eternity? The official explanation emphasizes beauty, symbolism, and celebration. The exposition showcased technological achievement, international cooperation, and cultural optimism. Its architecture reflected those ambitions. That interpretation makes perfect sense. But perhaps the temporary nature of the fair makes the larger pattern even more interesting. If architects invested this much effort into buildings designed to exist for only a few years, then monumental architecture was never simply about durability. It was also about memory. The experience itself mattered. Visitors were meant to remember what they had seen long after the buildings were gone. That idea begins to connect many of the earlier examples. A railway station celebrated movement. A library celebrated knowledge. A capital celebrated government. Here, temporary architecture celebrated civilization itself. Different functions, the same monumental language. Architecture once carried responsibilities beyond providing shelter. It framed ceremonies, marked transitions, created anticipation, encouraged reflection. reflection. Even crossing a courtyard or passing beneath an arch became part of the experience. Look carefully at the details preserved in the photographs, the rhythm of the colonnades, the deep shadows beneath the arches, the massive stone cornices catching afternoon light, the carefully proportioned staircases leading the eye forward. These are not random, decorative choices. They direct movement almost like stage scenery in a theater. The visitor becomes part of the composition. That may explain why these images remain so compelling today. They do not merely document architecture. They record how architecture guided human experience. The strange part is not what survived. It is what disappeared. Walk through many contemporary civic buildings. Efficiency dominates. Glass walls, standardized entrances, compressed budgets, minimal ornament, clear signage. These buildings often function extremely well, but they rarely attempt to transform an ordinary visit into a memorable public ritual. Some observers celebrate that shift. Others quietly mourn it. Neither response is necessarily correct. Architecture always reflects its own age. If the monumental buildings of the late 19th and early 20th centuries expressed confidence, continuity, and shared civic identity, perhaps today's buildings express transparency, flexibility, speed, and technological change instead. Different values naturally produce different forms. Yet the old photographs continue asking a remarkably persistent question. Why did previous generations expect architecture itself to create unforgettable public experiences, even when those experiences were designed to last only a single season? By this point, I realized the answer probably would not be found by looking at more buildings. It would have to be found by looking at the ideas that taught architects to build them in the first place. By this point, I stopped looking only at buildings. Instead, I started looking at the books that taught architects how to design them. That is where the investigation took an unexpected turn. 19th century architectural manuals, Beaux-Arts training, and classical design theory rarely described an entrance as a simple opening in a wall. Again and again, they treated it as a threshold, a carefully composed transition between the ordinary world outside and the institution within. Suddenly, many of the buildings I had been studying began to make more sense. Among them, few carry more symbolic weight than the United States Capitol. Between 1856 and 1866, its present cast-iron dome rose above Washington during one of the most turbulent periods in American history. The monumental east front entrances formed part of a much broader architectural statement. Classical design communicated continuity. The building projected permanence, even while the nation itself experienced profound conflict. The historical record is extensive. Construction methods are documented. Architectural drawings survive. Design decisions were carefully recorded. Restoration projects have preserved extraordinary detail. Nothing about the Capitol requires hidden explanations, but the design principles behind it reveal something worth noticing. Architecture was expected to teach before it sheltered, to prepare before it welcomed, to communicate ideals before a single word was spoken inside. Stand before the east front. Look carefully at the approach, the long flights of stone steps, the immense Corinthian columns, the deeply recessed bronze doors, the carved capitals disappearing high above eye level. The entrance unfolds gradually rather than all at once. Every proportion slows the visitor. Every layer increases the sense of arrival. The building does not simply provide access, it creates anticipation. Notice the historic photographs. Statesmen, visitors, children, soldiers. Each becomes remarkably small beneath the entrance. Once again, the people become measuring tools. The camera unintentionally records the same relationships seen in libraries, railway stations, museums, and exhibition halls. Human activity is temporary. The institution appears timeless. At first, I assumed this repeated because architects copied one another. In part, they did. But the manuals suggest something deeper. Classical architecture viewed thresholds as psychological spaces. Crossing them marked a transition from street to institution, from individual concerns to shared civic life, from ordinary activity to public responsibility. That idea quietly connects almost every example we have seen. Grand Central did not merely organize transportation, it prepared travelers for movement. The New York Public Library did not simply store books, it elevated learning. Antwerpen Centraal transformed arrival into an expression of national identity. The Palace of Fine Arts used monumental forms to preserve memory even within a temporary exposition, and the capital turned government itself into an architectural experience before any debate began inside. Suddenly, the giant doors stop looking like isolated design choices. They become part of a much larger philosophy, not a conspiracy, not a forgotten civilization, a philosophy that believed architecture could shape civic behavior. Whether it always succeeded is another question entirely. History is full of institutions that failed to live up to the ideals carved into their own stone facades. Politics changed, governments changed, societies changed. The architecture remained. Stone preserved ambitions that history often complicated. Bronze remembered ceremonies long after the participants were gone. The official explanation tells us how these entrances were designed. The architectural philosophy explains why they were given such extraordinary importance. And yet one final question still remains. If previous generations believed a doorway could shape the way people thought about public life, what does it mean when modern public architecture rarely asks the doorway to say anything at all? Look once more at the photographs, not as illustrations, as evidence. A family climbing marble steps, passengers entering Grand Central Terminal, readers approaching the New York Public Library, travelers passing through Antwerpen Centraal, visitors wandering beneath the arches of the Palace of Fine Arts, statesmen disappearing beneath the capital's monumental entrances, different countries, different decades, different architects, different institutions. Yet the same visual rhythm appears again and again. Tiny figures, immense thresholds, doorways that dominate the frame long before the people do. Once you begin noticing the details, they become difficult to ignore. The polished marble worn smooth by countless footsteps, the weathered bronze darkened where generations reached for the same handles, the deep recesses of stone portals casting heavy shadows around the entrance, the carved capitals, the massive lintels, the extraordinary thickness of the doors themselves. These buildings were never asking visitors merely to pass through them. They were asking them to arrive. Perhaps the historical explanation is complete. Perhaps monumental entrances simply represent the natural outcome of Beaux-Arts education, classical influence, civic ambition, engineering capability, and practical necessity. The evidence certainly supports that conclusion. The archives explain the construction. Architectural manuals explain the philosophy. Historic photographs preserve the result. And yet something remains. Not a missing civilization, not forgotten giants, not hidden technology. Something far quieter. Architecture communicates long after the builders are gone. The records explain how these entrances were assembled. They cannot entirely measure what those entrances encouraged people to feel. When we study these buildings today, we are not only looking at stone, bronze, iron, hardwood, and marble. We are looking at a civilization's expectations of itself. What it believed deserved permanence, what it considered worthy of ceremony, what it wanted ordinary citizens to experience on an ordinary day. Between approximately 1850 and 1930, societies across Europe and North America answered those questions with remarkable consistency. Transportation deserved dignity. Knowledge deserved dignity. Justice deserved dignity. Art deserved dignity. Government deserved dignity. Even the simple act of crossing a doorway into public life deserved architecture that felt larger than the individual. Whether those societies always lived up to those ideals is another matter. History reminds us that they often did not. But their buildings preserved the aspiration anyway. Stone outlasted politics. Bronze outlasted speeches. Marble outlasted generations. Perhaps that is why these entrances continue to fascinate us, not because we doubt how they were built, but because we quietly wonder whether we still build public spaces with the same confidence in the institutions they represent. The giant doors were never truly unexplained. Their engineering is documented. Their construction survives in archives. Their philosophy can still be traced through 19th century architectural education. The real mystery was never hidden behind the doors. It stood in front of them. Why did so many societies, separated by oceans, languages, and governments, repeatedly decide that ordinary people should enter extraordinary buildings, and, if every generation leaves behind architecture that reveals what it values most? When historians look at the entrances we build today, what story will they believe we were trying to tell?